So welcome. We just left some minutes ago, and then we are again here. So here tonight is a session within a series, you know, Haley, which is a series of public lecture, either on more theoretical aspects of the present current debate on territory, environment, nature, and or other sessions are more closely linked to what is the universe of system thinking. And we invited you within this second aspect of our sessions, so related to the system thinking, because in the frame of our Master of Advanced Studies, we are convinced that there is a relevance, opportunity, utility, and interest to reanimate, we can say, the tradition of system thinking, or to discover in some case, in my case, and in some other case, it is a complete discovery because we are not being accustomed and educated within this universe. I told you reanimate, but I'm sure that you are going to contest my expression, because I think that from your point of view, there's nothing to be reanimated. So there's something which is really lively now for you and for your studies. Haley, I'm going to introduce you. So it's also the first time that I meet Haley. Haley Fitzpatrick. She's an architect. She's an architect. And she's today a PhD student in the frame of the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and also, if I'm not wrong, also your PhD dissertation is done also in coordination with the MonViso Institute. The MonViso Institute will be at the core of the final session that you are going to have together with Tobias Luthi. And in the short bio that we have composed, we underline that you are working across architecture, landscape, systemic design, sustainability science. And the work you have done as architect, you have done it in the United States, in Italy at Renzo Piano Building Workshop in Genova. And presently you are completely in your day, duty as a PhD student, and you are also teaching because you co-teaches Master's Design Studios at the Oslo School. And at the same time, you are Design Associate at MonViso. This is all what I want to tell you for a presentation entitled, for your lecture entitled Gigamaps and Synthesis Maps, Visualizing and Engaging with Complexity for Real-World Change. So there, the stress for us is inviting you. The stress was on representation to a systemic approach of territorial phenomena. And we are really looking forward to discover these tools that are absolutely unknown for me, not under our current use tools. And it is interesting also because we have seen that we can, in fact, in a way, cultivate a systemic approach in a more hybrid way, putting together different tools, combining them from different traditions, more architecture or more systemic thinking in it. But what we are really expecting to know is to discover this more holistic approach that you can apply in the frame of a gigamap. So, Haley, I let you, if you want, also to complete the introduction that I give you, that I did you, and so the floor is yours, and we are happy to listen to you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was really great, and really appreciate the introduction. Hello to you all. I wish I could be there with you physically, but I'm actually in the mountains right now, not these mountains in Norway, but in Italy, in the Italian Alps at the MonViso Institute. So you heard this from Elena, and you will hear about this next time with Tobias, who is also my supervisor for my PhD. So I will, let's just go to the next slide here. Yeah, so I think Elena, you described me pretty well. And yeah, the intent behind this talk I wanted to give is really to, yeah, try to stimulate some critical thinking and discussion from you all as well, between representation and systems thinking, and how this relates to design for real world change. And just as a quick background as where my PhD is coming from, to maybe help give you a little bit of a context as I'm speaking. So I am looking at how systemic design, and specifically systems-oriented design, which is where I'm the discipline that I'm based in the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, how these methodologies can be used to more collaboratively and co-creatively engage with narratives, you know, storytelling and community-based, place-based knowledge across mountain communities to stimulate greater transformative action. And so I think in the fields of architecture and urban design and landscape, where you all are coming from, I think you're rather already thinking about, you know, merging between different systems. I think there's already so much potential, as Elena said, to make these synergies. And I think in my experience, also being an architect, being in architecture in academia as well for a long time now, I think getting more into systemic design, there's a lot of potential here, especially in the realm of communication. So I will introduce a few methodologies and approaches within systemic design that I've started to experiment with in my own PhD work. And this is all a learning in process. So I'm really interested to hear your perspectives and critical analysis on this, and yeah, have a conversation after. So I hope this is meaningful to you. So I just start with talking a little bit about what I see kind of the current representation that's becoming kind of regaining popularity from like the early 90s of collage making with you know, people like James Corner or even Zaha Hadid, who have, you know, tried in some way to represent this complexity of what the territory is and representing that. And you know, these are very beautiful, intriguing drawings that are attempting to show this complexity, what's happening underneath the surface. But I think they're quite purposefully ambiguous, and you're probably familiar with these kind of communication devices. And I think this is quite a classic approach to maintain a sense of imagination, rather than using you know, more realistic interpretations of what a design project should be, or what is territory today. But at the same time, these are only accessible to those who understand this language. You know, there's a certain kind of literacy involved in reading these kinds of drawings. And so, you know, they remain a drawing to provoke, but they're not really something to engage with from, you know, a public perspective. And I'm very curious in kind of seeing how we could use this collage or different ways of working with representation that's in urban design and landscape and architecture, but translating that into a way to help motivate people and engage people to care more about their places, their territories, and engage in this transformation process that, you know, is required. because clearly we are in a socio-ecological crisis. And I will not go into too much detail here because I think you all are aware and can in your studio are working to address this in some way. But even if we are willing and eager and happy to try to take some responsibility in this as designers, we are facing right now by this kind of globally dominant reductionist approach to decision making and how we act under uncertainty. We're not addressing complex issues holistically. We pour billions of euros into very short-term kind of recovery plans, but we're not connecting to the broader issues. We focus on COVID, but we forget about climate change, or we forget about the even bigger wave of what could happen if we don't have biodiversity anymore. So what we really need is transformative change, really deep paradigm shift on how we think about and operate in the world. And there's growing agreement across sustainability science, across various other disciplines, that we need to pay more attention to the root drivers of these very wicked, complex problems. The values, the beliefs, the assumptions, and mental models that shape how we connect to nature, how we connect to each other. And this is popularized in a diagram here that's based off of the kind of classic system thinkers like Donella Meadows, Peter Senge, and more recently David Abson, who indicate that these sort of visible events that you see at the top of the dashed curve, these that we can see on a daily basis, these are manifestations of deeper invisible patterns, systems, societal structures, and worldviews. And this is driven by how our mental models are shaped. And tapping into what drives our worldviews and mental models is really where the sort of greatest transformative impact occurs. If you see the arrow pointing down. And on the right-hand side, these are just some examples of what these kind of different levels of impact could be. We can change material flows, we can change supply systems, we can change the rules of governance, but the most powerful impact is really the intention, shifting our mindsets more holistically. So how can we, co-design together to create more regenerative societies that are life-giving and support more holistic well-being? This is a highly complex issue to solve, and this is why we're still not taking the widespread action that is needed to really, transform our societies. And I like to use this example here of an old stone ruin of a building that's very common in the landscape of the Italian mountains where the MonViso Institute is based. And this can easily just be seen as, an object in landscape. You see it as part of the context, it kind of blends in, But if you start to map out all of the hidden complexities behind this very kind of simple object, there are many different perspectives and worldviews that are coming together in sometimes tensions and conflicting relationships. And thinking about the salamanders who are now inhabiting this old ruin, or the World War II partigiani soldiers who were part of the resistance force, use this as hideaways. Or today there's a large migrant community working in the stone quarries to harvest this Luzerna stone to create even more buildings that are all questioning the sort of plurality in different kinds of multiple ways of thinking about something seemingly as simple as collection of stones. So complexity can either invite people or discourage people from engaging and seeing themselves as part of these systems. And in some way or another, help to inspire change. So I think of human nature, which is seen as the kind of symbol of the web of life, or they call it the tree of life. And you know, these those who are inside such networks have a very nuanced and very visceral lived experience of what this complexity means, that those on the outside, like myself, will never really be able to experience the full entanglement of that. But I can still relate to this and still appreciate this and have a kind of basic understanding. On a very different end of the spectrum, you can see in a lot of kind of scientific ways or westernized ways of dealing with complexity can be seen through these kinds of causality maps, negative, positive feedback loops, trying to understand what is influencing the system, what are the kind of push and pull drivers, if it's about, you know, healthcare or fisheries. It's such a wide range of things. But facts are quite dominant in these kinds of ways of representing complexity, and the narratives behind each of these bubbles or, you know, square shapes here in the connector arrows. You know, these kind of narratives are flattened into a very sort of cold and calculated technical understanding. So one also needs to be deeply engaged in a particular community to be able to read this, to be able to engage with this. So those two examples, one from the Mayan indigenous community and the other from kind of a scientific community, these are very two distinct and different ways of representing complexity. And rarely do we see that those two different kinds of, you know, knowledge systems coming together in the same place. And, you know, each approach can really contribute to how we think about transformative change. We need room for intuition. We need room for diverse ways of knowing. But at the same time, we need facts and data. And all of these different ways can work together to help us be more resilient and make more systematic decisions and decision-making under complex and uncertain conditions as well. So this kind of plurality, this notion of bringing together many different aspects and cultures and perspectives, and et cetera, is really part of this goal that we need to have in order to achieve holistic well-being. You know, there are global standards, global goals that we need to achieve in a very short amount of time, but each path and sort of pathway to get there is highly diverse. So we can see this as, you know, where are the synergies between understanding where consensus really counts, where do we really need to agree on things, and where can differences really shine? What are our common goals as a global society, but where is it also beneficial to have the healthy diversity and diverse strategies that we need to achieve those goals? So this is what I think really a systemic systems thinking approach is a highly effective way of addressing these complexities. And we really cannot afford to address issues or make decisions within distinct boundaries anymore, or a kind of reductionist mindset. So luckily, we don't have to look very far to find really kind of clear pathways forward. Because a systems thinking approach is nothing new. It's based on many thousands of years of ancient cultures and indigenous ways of knowing that have been practicing holistic connection with their greater environments and the systems around them. And, you know, we kind of lost our way perhaps during the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution when we tried to, you know, over control or oversimplify or make things too efficient, and losing sight of this kind of emergent aspect of systems that will actually help us be more resilient in the future. So there's of course a ton of information on complex adaptive systems and systems theories. You can read all about this, but I want to just focus more on the kind of particular highlights of mindsets and approaches for holistic well-being. So thinking about everything as interconnected, reciprocal networks. If you do something in one part of the system, there will be an effect somewhere else. So every single action will have some kind of impact. And, you know, thinking about multifunctional, multi-adaptive solutions that are resilient and constantly changing. Systems are never truly defined. They're always porous and fluid with boundaries that are liquid in some way. You know, boundaries are a human construct. So we need to think more about how nature works, being inspired by natural systems. And ultimately, you know, thinking about how systems construct, they're also autopoietic, also sympoietic. So self-organizing as well as sympoietic, which is organizing with other components. So it's a collective process, constantly building upon other things. So this is, of course, very different than how we're working today, how we're operating in society today. You know, we want a lot of control, high prediction. There's a lot of over-engineering, trying to streamline, you know, our lifestyles in some way. And we're not okay with not knowing. But this is not what makes resilient systems able to adapt to change. So one particular framework on the right that I just wanted to briefly talk about that I think will be relevant for you all in your particular studio that is more spatially grounded is this cross-scalar design and governance framework that I've been working with Tobias Lute, my supervisor, as well as Daniel Wall. And it's part of an in-progress paper that we're working on. But it's basically looking at different nested scalar, cross-scalar circularities with, you know, going from the very smallest understanding of a green chemistry to materials, buildings, communities, landscapes, bioregions, and this larger global network. So thinking about all of the circular opportunities for cross-connecting between these scales when designing or making decisions under complexity. And I wanted to emphasize the bioregion. So this kind of mid-scale circle in the middle, which is really kind of the optimal scale for human activity to thrive without jeopardizing the life-giving resources. So the bioregion, I think, is in some way similar to what you all are calling as territories in your studio. So these are, you know, different language, different perhaps classification, but bioregional scholars use this term as more kind of fluid that relates to natural delineations of regions, so watersheds, mountain ranges, etc. So this is one way of thinking about systems, that they are cross-scalar and adaptive and circular in nature. So this brings us to systemic design. So the core of systemic design is this combination of holistic mindsets, connections across scales and levels, and really bringing that way of working into a design practice. At the same time, merging different and other sources of knowledge, such as sustainability science or ethnographic research, really trying to carve out a space to experiment and explore and hybridize these different methodologies as a way to build towards transformative practice and activating real world change. So how can we understand in the whole complexity of all these different systems connecting together, where does it make sense to change something? Where and how does that link to other points in the system? So that's what systemic design is really looking at, these interventions and opportunities to generate future pathways towards solutions. And just a quick note here that, you know, systemic design is an approach, it's a methodology, it's a praxeology, but it can have any kind of normative association. You can systemically design, you know, nuclear weapons, of course. So what is really important here is to clarify the intention behind systemic design approaches. And this graphic, for example, is from a workshop that my colleagues Justina Swat, Birger Selvesen, and Tobias Lute have developed on this question of when is systemic design regenerative? So what are the kind of values, the currencies and tools that help us understand when systemic design is contributing towards holistic well-being, planetary health, regenerative sustainability, and where there are moments where perhaps it's not. So I hope that's kind of, you know, a general background to help frame a little bit about the why behind engaging in complexity, engaging in systems. So I'd like to just show a little bit now on some particular mapping techniques. So these particular methods here used within systemic design. So in general, this is a lot of the work is based off of system mapping, which is kind of a general understanding of anything from causality to resource flows and supply chains. But it's basically, the goal is to understand the current situation of systems and their relationships to each other. You know, the what is before understanding the future, or what could be, what are the possibilities to change it. So understanding what is driving, what is visible on the surface. If you remember the diagram I showed in the beginning, what are these kind of underlying push and pull factors to generate these kind of visible effects we see today? For example, you know, landslides, wildfires, or political polarization on mask wearing in the US, for example. There's all sorts of drivers that are contributing to that. So these kinds of system maps attempt to track that. But again, there's a very, you know, kind of flattening of information here. It's very diagrammatic. So this again is a critical point to critically reflect upon, is to what extent is all of the complexity shown, and how do you choose and how do you decipher what is meant to be shown here. So this kind of leads me to a specific core within many systemic design practices, especially in systems-oriented design. So this was one kind of component or under the umbrella of systemic design, but looking at a more designerly way to approach systems. So which focuses really on the relationships between seemingly unrelated entities. So this is a highly iterative process that Birger Selvesen at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design started experimenting with. I mean, I think probably early 2000s. So really quite innovative and still really high potential to expand. And it's a very process-oriented and organic approach. You just kind of start mapping out very dialogic, conversationally with other people, other designers, other stakeholders, throwing out ideas, trying to understand their challenges, their problem, what is at the crux of the various systems relating to a particular project, for example. And the beauty of gigamapping is, unlike many other approaches, which you see in the small diagram on the lower left-hand corner, is instead of oversimplifying and kind of funneling information into funneling complex information into an oversimplified diagram, gigamapping is a tunneling approach. So it's really about translating complexity into something digestible that people can relate to and see themselves within the system and start to generate ideas about how to intervene, where to change, etc. So many times this starts out as a kind of big, messy group drawing where you're just trying to throw down as many ideas as possible and connections that and observations that you may have. And then there's, as I said, it's very iterative. You go back and you look at the map and you try to understand and analyze these connections. For example, through these techniques that Birger has developed called impact and threshold analysis, or ZIP analysis, so zooming in. Where do I need to zoom in further to understand this thing? Or how do I zoom out to make bigger connections? Where are interventions and ideas, pain points, challenges, etc. And then this information again is going through other processes like sense sharing. So fact-checking, cross-checking with stakeholders, experts, other individuals to validate the information that you're mapping. And, this also brings up, I think, a really interesting point of critical reflection as well, to understand, the limitations of how we really evaluate these complex maps. And the metrics can become kind of fuzzy, especially if there's only one person engaging in this. So it's really about, I think, taking the time and engaging as many different perspectives and voices to really collaboratively work together on this, as well as quantitative analysis. Scientific tools like social network analysis is another layer that could be added on to give that kind of other sounding board to fact check and cross check this information. So that is a very kind of process-based tool. Gigamaps are very rich in their complexity. And Birger is usually describing that it's impossible to really understand or explain them in just a few minutes. So that's kind of the beauty about that technique. On the other hand, synthesis maps, which is a kind of way to think about explaining complexity that is very, for an outsider who's not involved in making that map can easily understand this. So having clear narratives, clear visual understanding. It's Peter Jones, who's very involved in developing these kind of synthesis maps. He calls them communicative artifacts or visual narratives. So they're really designed to be accessible to stakeholders and those to quickly engage in these highly complex issues and representations of systems. So this is not an easy task, however. So it's a kind of balance between understanding, unlike infographics, where these maps are really a representation of a lived reality of the system. so they can open up opportunities to engage and understand how we can see visions for the future. So, yeah. So just some other examples here of synthesis maps that you've probably maybe experimented with in your studies or seen other examples. I think in architecture and landscape architecture and urban design, these kind of classic boards that we've been trained to prepare to communicate a design project are starting to have some interesting overlaps with what the synthesis map is also doing. And I think from an architectural and landscape perspective, the benefit of these is really like a spatial grounding of these systems and a contextual grounding, place-based. They're not just bubbles with lines, but you start to see these systems in a very tangible way. Yet at the same time, I think another critical point to think about with these kind of synthesis maps is that they are inherently streamlined. They're meant to be quite clear and tailored down, eliminating certain information because you simply cannot show everything. But this then raises questions of, okay, what do you choose to show? What is deemed important? Who is deciding that? Are these systems represented justly from which perspectives? And this is, again, this raises the question of a kind of flattening of highly complex systems. So we run the risk of reducing very complex stories to something that could just be easily, flattened into a 2D image. So it's this kind of balance between making this communication accessible, but also holding that space for uncertainty and dealing with complexity and knowing that this is not always a simple, solution sometimes. So this brings me to kind of a final couple points here about going beyond these maps. And something that I'm experimenting with now is really literally trying to get beyond the 2D sort of flattening and how we think about visualizing complex systems to understanding the reality of those entangled kind of lived systems. And this requires more creative partnerings with other communication tools and devices as well. So just to give a couple examples of some recent things happening at the MonViso Institute is this concept of systemic cycles. So this can be a new way of activating bioregional supply chains within across regions. It's also transnationally as well. And giga mapping acted as this kind of preparation tool to start to map out the systems, generate ideas, make connections. Layered onto that was a kind of synthesis map, as you can see in the middle image here, which was done by students at the Polytechnico of Torino. So these were used to engage with stakeholders and try to, again, make this information more accessible, easily readable. And then the beautiful thing that happened is that during the summertime, a group of people who were involved in making these maps and working with the students went and did a biking tour of all of the different businesses and sites that were part of this sort of bioregional circular supply chain mapping. So this was part of the sense sharing and really living through these experiences and demonstrating very clear and concretely these complex systems. And I think what really kind of the result that came out of this was that all different people involved was that, worldviews were widened. Different kind of perceptions and understanding of your place within these systems were challenged and realized in different ways. So this is what I mean about getting beyond the kind of 2D map and really living in these systems and taking the time to do so. And I will just leave on one kind of final example here, which is related to my PhD. And as I mentioned before, I'm doing a comparative analysis of 3 different mountain communities. So one being in the Ostana, where the MonViso Institute is located in Italy, the other in California, and one in Hemsedal in Norway, which is where my university is based in Norway. So Hemsedal is a really interesting case because it's a prime example of exploring and trying to understand better these alpine urban synergies. And I can just quickly zoom in here. This is part of another ongoing framework that I'm developing with Tobias as well. This, idea that rural and mountain places always have a kind of dependency on urban areas, and the same and vice versa. Urban places rely on water and agriculture and other kinds of resources from the mountains. And the mountains rely on the kind of capital and tourism and other kinds of economic models. But at the same time, what we see now, especially with COVID, challenging this understanding of what rural and urban is, and really showing us that we need to build more synergy and more solidarity between these different components, and understanding how we can come together on creating more joint climate change action. So this is something we can maybe discuss later in the discussion, but what I wanted to just focus on briefly was how I'm starting to look at this in a kind of narrative framework and format in Hemsedal, which is a real world example of building these kind of long-term co-creative engagements with research students at Oslo in a real context. So social relationships, social encounters are highly important in crafting these collaborative ways of building sustainability transitions. So I'm very curious in how these kind of emergent encounters translate into opportunities for systemic change. So I just quickly go through an example here. We went up to Hemsedal with our students for 1 week for an excursion to really live and feel the place. And we rented bikes, e-bikes, and explored the area on electric bikes. And this opened up really interesting emergent opportunities. So, when we were exploring the valley on our bikes, we stopped at these kind of different sites that were just completely spontaneous. So we met with Arne, a local farmer, who then started to talk about a new kind of volunteer organization engaging with sheep herding. So having volunteers from the community, tourists come together and help herd the sheep from the high pastures to bring them down for the winter time. So he was telling us about this experience, and we then translated that to our students, and they started to gigamap this in our cabin that we rented. So they're then processing this information. At the same time, some students were interested in joining this sheep herding opportunity. So the next day, we just had several students join that, and they had a really fantastic understanding, a very visceral understanding of what this kind of economic and social model is in this particular community. And, that was one example. Another example is we had a spontaneous meeting with the mayor, Paul Roby. Just on our bikes, we passed by the municipality, said hello, started to talk, And then this led to a collective giga mapping session with the students to really map out the visions that Paul has from the community, and also, you know, speaking on behalf of the community members about pathways towards sustainable futures for Hemsedal. But clearly there's challenges and complexities that have not yet been resolved. So the students were trying to map this out, and this was really successful. And this led to several different projects. Idea for our Hemsedal golf course to be more regenerative, politician training course for training politicians to be more aware of their context of alpine communities that are transitioning towards sustainable futures. And this then leads to, you know, other scales, other areas in the Alps. And yeah, these creative workshops and different opportunities ultimately came back with the students in Oslo and in the university. And that was then translated again back into this kind of systemic thinking approach. So I just wanted to show briefly this kind of cross-scalar, cross-spatial connection between how very kind of seemingly unimportant connections can really have a systemic effect. And this is through different ways of learning too. Mind-body engagement, moving your body, experiencing yourself in space, collective mapping, and exchanging stories in real time. So this is a work in progress, trying to experiment a little bit with, thinking beyond the kind of system map as we know it, but really engaging in this kind of broader real life experiment. So I just wanted to end here that systems thinking and how we communicate this and understand complexity, it's a mindset and it's a process. And I encourage you all to really take this with you during your studies, but also in your daily life. You know, it's okay to not know. And in fact, it's better that we are always challenging ourselves, being critical, befriending uncertainty, and really embracing the complexity of our world today and not trying to reduce it into something too simple. And I think the last point here, living in questions. You know, we're always so eager to have an answer to everything, but it's not always the case. You know, it's this, we have to think more about evolving and really living in this process of change. So I think this will help us and hopefully inspire you guys. So yeah, thank you so much. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Haley. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. So, are there questions from the audience?
Any questions? You would address.
I know it's probably a lot of information.
Yeah, one here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. And my question was more on what happened once you reached back to the university, because we've also been working with this idea of mapping what exists and sort of collective imageries of people on site and what they would want or what are their aspirations for the territory, etc. But the major crisis I would say we are in right now is to then take this forward with us back in the design room. And if you'd have any experiences to share as to how was this done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a really important one too, because this is part of, you know, engaging with communities in real context, it's a long process, and you need a lot of time to build these partnerships, and it's really iterative. So we had a 1 month long module on this particular design studio, but this is part of a longer collaboration within my university and my PhD project and other projects as well. So the idea is that when we go back to the design space in Oslo, it's a way for, you know, the students and us as well to kind of digest the information, try to make sense of it from a different perspective, but take that back in a form that's clear and understandable for the community of Hemsedal to react to. So in fact, I failed to mention this, but in December, we're going to go back to Hemsedal and present what we were, you know, exploring and thinking about. And we're going to engage in yet another collective gigamapping process. So it's just super iterative, this process. So I hope in your case, you're able to take this information back to the community or context that you're working in order to get that feedback, because that's really the key, is to have that exchange. So.
Thank you. Is there another question here?
Thank you. At the very beginning, you showed us different ways of representing maps done by different universities. It kind of shows a trend. And I was just wondering, I mean, you're still in the process of mapping all these complex systems through diagrams. I was just wondering, will you also go into translating these diagrams in actual maps as we see here, or is it still like kind of still too complex, or like how the step of translating it into an actual map as we understand now? Because your diagram is also a map. It's just that it's not in the way that we know it or we read it. So I was just wondering how this will continue in your work.
Yes, thank you so much. This is, I'm really interested in this, actually. And of course, I'm coming from, you know, a habit or way of representing that I'm used to, I know how to do, I'm comfortable with, you know, how we're trained in some way. And it's an active process for me during my PhD to be highly critical. So trying to understand, okay, what is really matters here? What can I really show in such a map or drawing or whatever kind of tool you want to call it? Can this really inspire action taking? You know, is this clear enough? Is the complexity represented in such a way that is accessible? At the same time, that's a really hard thing to do when you have so many different perspectives and systems and interlocking and often conflicting information. Not everyone's agreeing about what should be brought to the surface. You know, there's so many tensions that are what often blocks change from really happening. So it's a really delicate process, especially working with communities that you know, have their own understanding and perception of the systems that they're living in. So I think just to try to answer your question more specifically, it's something I'm exploring as well in my PhD, this particular representation method. And I don't yet know the answer, but it's probably going to be some kind of hybridization of everything in some way. That's also at the same time providing clarity. So it's a very in progress step for me right now, but I appreciate this question.
I was just wondering, because you were thinking about how these conflicts, it's very conflictual, right? You have different systems and how they collide. Would like first step be to work in layers? So you have different layers of different systems and you just like try to overlap them and then see what the connections are, or because we're actually struggling with the same thing. So it's just like, what is like a first step into which methodology of dealing with this?
Yeah, I think layering is really can be really helpful when you start to, especially if you have different spatial layers, political layers, socio-ecological, transportation. You know, these are quite easy to literally superimpose in some kind of map that then you can see overlaps that maybe you didn't realize before. It's not so easy to do that with social networks, or, you know, trying to represent the complexity of different actors in a system and the power dynamics between them. That is harder to superimpose on a particular site or context. I can show you actually, I don't have it here, but what I'm trying to do now is explore layering different kind of narratives on particular spatial locations. So these social encounters that we came across, meeting Arne, the farmer, or various other stakeholders in the community, each had a story behind that. So I was trying to pinpoint spatially where those were connected and understand if there's some kind of relationship there. But I think it's such like a process, trial and error. I think the best thing to do is to really be bold and be brave and try to just get as much understanding as you can of the entire relationships and really challenge yourself to think beyond what you might consider a system to be. And I think working with others is really helpful as well. You know, pairing up with your teammates, having this kind of exchange, this dialogue about it, will help you uncover these different ways of trying to represent it first. I mean, first you have to understand, then you can try to represent. But it's a very, I think, yeah, it can be a really difficult process, but one that's really valuable. When you get something out of it, I think it's really worth the effort.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe other questions? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
And thank you for your presentation. In designing or generating giga maps, how could we recognize what kind of relationships we have to focus on? I mean, do we know? Should we focus on all the relationships between systems, and is there any certain methods to recognize what kind of relationships we have to choose?
Yeah, that is a great question. Let me just jump here. Yeah, so this is the part that I was describing here in evaluation tools. Like, it's one thing to just map everything, right? But it's another situation to understand what is valid, what counts, you know, what's meaningful. And I think the best way to approach this is through many different methods. So, of course, there are these kind of zip analysis or impact and threshold analysis that are part of systems-oriented design that helps you see connections between. For example, one way of thinking about it, we had all of our students pick various topics. Someone was focused on mobility, others was focused on like power dynamics, food and agriculture. So very kind of, let's say, common ways of defining systems. And they started to map out all of these relationships. And then that was a kind of individual exercise. And then there was a hybridization exercise afterwards where everyone put their maps together in Miro. And we started describing and seeing patterns emerge. So there's something to be said about when patterns start to emerge, that there's probably some kind of importance there. And there are different ways of recognizing and validating patterns. You can do it quantitatively through scientific methods. You can do it through spatial analysis, pattern mapping, or various qualitative ways. You know, there's something to be said too about intuition in this case. That's what a lot of designerly methods are based on. So it's a combination, and really taking that information that you as a designer maybe come up with or start to highlight as important, and taking that back to experts, stakeholders, people who are involved in these systems, very detailed and nuanced, and getting that feedback, having that exchange. That will then help clarify what is really important. But at the same time, everyone has a different perspective of what's, you know, really important. So again, it's a layering process, an iterative process. It's not a simple solution. So, and it was a very long answer.
Yeah.
Following up on the previous question, I was wondering if one of the major, personal battles also, so to say, that I'm having is when you have these diagrammatic relationships and the moment you start spatializing them.
Yes.
And the sort of push or the need to have, say, an architectural representation of this relationship, and not just the existing one, but the one that is aspirational or is what you want, is a big sort of a bridge that still needs to be built. And if you've started making attempts into taking these gigamaps or analyses into those kind of representations and how that's sort of coming up.
Yeah, I think it's a really, I think someone had a similar question to like these sort of collage spatial maps and how that connects to these diagrams. And, you know, I think something that maybe is a helpful way to think about this is that we don't necessarily, I don't think we need to always superimpose everything. I think we can have separate drawings, separate representations of the same thing, but just done in a different way. So, I mean, these examples here are, I would say, rather standard in some way for landscape architecture, urban design, etc., to combine the kind of current situation with desired, future goals or future solutions. But I think for your question as well, to think more about, there's there's meaning behind separating some of this information, and having a kind of map that is more able to scale across those, but not necessarily be completely superimposed, if that makes sense. Because I think sometimes we make a mistake as architects, landscape, urban designers. We try to fit so much information in just one drawing, but in fact we need many different ones, but that are in a kind of connected way of understanding them. So this is something I'm also really interested in exploring as well. But I would encourage you to just try to, explore through a kind of experiment, a separation approach, but then linking them back to each other. could be an option.
Thanks for this advice, because it will be exactly the theme of the workshop we will do next week, to build to tackle complexity approaching three type of sections, and they trying to mix and to superpose. And regarding to this question of the section you mentioned many current tools now from architecture and urbanism and landscape, the map we talk about, but also the posters and diagrams we are used to use, but also the section appears to me as something really relevant in terms of architecture, also to offer a synthesis of complex situation on one drawing. And as you said, to go beyond a 2D map, so the capacity of the section to mix and to propose an overview of the complexity will be appreciated, I hope, next week. And I don't know if you have special comments regarding to, because the main part of the diagrams or the gigamaps you show are really horizontal now, and how this third dimension could bring some help regarding to this, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think also what is a really interesting possibility is doing a kind of literal 3D gigamap in a model. You know, you could imagine layering different systems in a 3D model situation as a potential thing to experiment with for your studio. I think sections, I love sections in general. I mean, they're one of my favorite ways of representing, you know, buildings and landscapes and whatnot. And actually working at Renzo Pianos, we did a lot of bas-relief sections. So they were like this thick with many different layers of information that actually was kind of like what's it called? Like a shadow box where you start to see the depth, you know. I think, yeah, you have to be careful about, is that really showing something different than a kind of 2D drawing? I think what could be maybe even more interesting is combining drawings with video, with voiceover, doing these kind of other, maybe non-architectural methods to show more the kind of narratives behind these drawings and layer information that way. I mean, we have our voices as tools, we have videos as a kind of experiential ways, or again, like some kind of model that you can really spatially inhabit that and when you experience and understand. So maybe you don't have so much time to do this as the semester is coming to a close, but yeah, I would encourage you to be courageous with this.
We will have 2 whole day to test the giga section.
Test it. I would love to see some
giga
pictures.
section hypothesis, no?
Yeah. I mean, you can literally just start stacking things with, you know, string or some kind of wires. I mean, it can be, you can start out very literally just to start somewhere. I mean, the best thing is just to start, because we get sometimes kind of caught in a paralysis if something is too complex, but the best thing is just to start, and you will see some really interesting things coming out, I'm sure. Yeah.
Is there any more comment from the audience?
Maybe just from my side.
Yeah, maybe Elena, you can.
A very simple and very, you know, direct question.
Yeah.
How does it long it takes to make a gigamap? I mean, because the gigamap is process itself is a process, and people that are involved are in the process in a way. And if I have correctly understood, gigamaps can't be really transmitted to others. So it's part of an experience of knowledge and production and knowledge sharing. But how long can a group of people be involved? Is there a sort of, you know, a sort of physiological limit? I mean, some days, no, how does it?
Yeah, I answer you, yes. Birger loves to say, whatever time you have, you can make a gigamap. So if you have 5 minutes, you can make it in 5 minutes, you know?
Yeah.
Wow.
If you have 1 hour.
Yeah,
sorry?
no, but I mean, really, yes, absolutely. I think that is very clear. It's very possible to make it in short time, and but maybe just the idea of which could be the maximum time to build a gigamap.
I think, you know, if you imagine the first iteration is several hours, maybe by yourself, you take another iteration, next day with other people, you start to build some sense checking, fact checking, you know, maybe another iteration, but it's really, I think, quite accessible. You know, it's not something that requires months of time. You know, I think it depends on how well you know the system that you are mapping, or the systems. I think if you have really clear ideas or observations, or you just came back from a really detailed experience that you want to just like remember everything, I think you can make it really quickly. So I think it depends on the context a lot, but I think easily, yeah.
Yes, because I can imagine that it is not a sort of neutrally transmittable outcome. You can really understand it if you are in the process. So there is times within which someone can being brought on board, but this being brought on board must be also be sort of made with sort of intermediation.
Exactly.
It's just I understand it completely. That is sort of a lively process, a living process.
Yes.
Okay. No, it's quite fascinating and challenging.
But this is a very important point too about how to bring people into this these worlds. And this is the kind of synthesis map idea that, you know, creating some kind of artifact that is quite easily, you know, read or understood. But at the same time, you lose the complexity of that rich process. So it's really this kind of interesting balance to try to find the combination between clarity, but also not losing the, you know, rich complexity. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to keep experimenting with this. And from the questions in the audience, I think you all are right on target of, you know, okay, you realize that this could maybe be something useful for your studies, but you're critical about it. I think that's really good. So yeah, I look forward to maybe seeing what you're working on in your workshop in the next days.
Thank you.
I've seen that Tanakala already asked if there is any more question in the Zoom audience. We can also listen us. No more question from the Zoom part.
No.
Not was just.
No.
No. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Haley. And yeah. With pleasure, we will share the result of our experiences next week. We can send you some of it. And at the end of the semester also, we will have a clear presentation of the material on which the participants of this mass are working on.
Great.
So many thanks to everyone, and thanks to Ale. And maybe we can close the session here. I don't know, Elena, if you want to address some. No. Okay, thank you very much, and see you in 2 weeks for the next session.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Ale.
Everyone, thank you so much. Looking forward.